Section 12 of the Golden Bough, A Study in Magic and Religion, Part 4, Religion-Adonis-Attis-Osiris-Volume 1, by Sir James George Frazer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Chapter 10. The Gardens of Adonis. Pots of corn, herbs, and flowers called the Gardens of Adonis. Perhaps the best proof that Adonis was a deity of vegetation, and especially of the corn, is furnished by the Gardens of Adonis, as they were called. These were baskets or pots filled with earth, in which wheat, barley, lettuces, fennel, and various kinds of flowers were sown and tended for 8 days, chiefly or exclusively by women. Fostered by the sun's heat, the plants shot up rapidly, but having no root, they withered as rapidly away, and at the end of 8 days were carried out with the images of the dead Adonis, and flung with them into the sea or into the springs. These Gardens of Adonis were charms to promote the growth of vegetation. The throwing of the gardens into water was a rain charm. Parallel European customs of drenching the corn with water at harvest or sowing, use of water as a rain charm at harvest and sowing. These Gardens of Adonis are most naturally interpreted as representatives of Adonis or manifestations of his power. They represented him, true to his original nature, in vegetable form, while the images of him with which they were carried out and cast into the water portrayed him in his latter human shape. All these Adonis ceremonies, if I am right, were originally intended as charms to promote the growth or revival of vegetation, and the principle by which they were supposed to produce this effect was homeopathic or imitative magic. For ignorant people supposed that by mimicking the effect which they desired to produce, they actually helped to produce it. Thus by sprinkling water they make rain, by lighting a fire they make sunshine, and so on. Similarly, by mimicking the growth of crops, they hope to ensure a good harvest. The rapid growth of the wheat and barley in the Gardens of Adonis was intended to make the corn shoot up, and the throwing of the gardens and of the images into the water was a charm to secure a due supply of fertilizing rain. The same, I take it, was the object of throwing the effigies of death and the carnival into water in the corresponding ceremonies of modern Europe. Certainly, the custom of drenching with water a leaf-clad person who undoubtedly personifies vegetation is still resorted to in Europe for the express purpose of producing rain. Similarly, the custom of throwing water on the last corn cut at harvest, or on the person who brings it home, a custom observed in Germany and France, and till quite lately in England and Scotland, is in some places practiced with the avowed intent to procure rain for the next year's crops. Thus in Wallachia, and amongst the Romanians in Transylvania, when a girls bring home a crown made of the last ears of corn cut at harvest, all who meet her hasten to throw water on her, and 2 farm servants are placed at the door for the purpose, for they believe that if this were not done, the crops next year would perish from drought. So amongst the Saxons of Transylvania, the person who wears the wreath made of the last corn is drenched with water to the skin, for the wetter he is, the better will be next year's harvest, and the more grain there will be threshed out. Sometimes the wearer of the wreath is the reaper who cut the last corn. In northern Euboea, when the corn sheaves have been piled in a stack, the farmer's wife brings a pitcher of water and offers it to each of the labourers that he may wash his hands. Every man, after he has washed his hands, sprinkles water on the corn and on the threshing floor, expressing at the same time a wish that the corn may last long. Lastly, the farmer's wife holds the pitcher slantingly and runs at full speed round the stack without spilling a drop, while she utters a wish that the stack may endure as long as the circle she has just described. At the spring ploughing in Prussia, when the ploughman and sowers returned in the evening from their work in the fields, the farmer's wife and the servants used to splash water over them. The ploughman and sowers retorted by seizing everyone, throwing them into the pond, and ducking them under the water. The farmer's wife might claim exemption on payment of a forfeit, but everyone else had to be ducked. By observing this custom, they hoped to ensure a due supply of rain for the seed. Also, after harvest in Prussia, the person who wore a wreath made of the last corn cut was drenched with water, while a prayer was uttered that, as the corn had sprung up and multiplied through the water, so it might spring up and multiply in the barn or granary. At Schladau, in Brandenburg, when the sowers returned home from the first sowing, they are drenched with water in order that the corn may grow. In Anhalt, on the same occasion, the farmer is still often sprinkled with water by his family, and his men and horses, and even the plough, receive the same treatment. The object of the custom, as people in Arensdorf explained it, is to wish fertility on the fields for the whole year. So in Hesse, when the ploughmen return with the plough from the field for the first time, the women and girls lie in wait for them and slyly drench them with water. Near Naumburg, in Bavaria, the man who first comes back from sowing or ploughing has a vessel of water thrown over him by someone in hiding. At Hedingen, in Baden, the farmer who is about to begin the sowing of oats is sprinkled with water in order the oats may not shrivel up. Before the Tusayan Indians in North America go out to plant their fields, the women sometimes pour water on them. The reason for doing so is that, as the water is poured on the men, so may water fill on the planted fields. The Indians of Santiago Tepucan steep the seed of the maize in water before they sow it, in order that the God of the waters may bestow on the fields the needed moisture. Gardens of Adonis among the Oreons and Mandas of Bengal. The opinion that the gardens of Adonis are essentially charms to promote the growth of vegetation, especially of the crops, and that they belong to the same class of customs as those spring and midsummer folk customs of modern Europe, which I have described elsewhere, does not rest for its evidence merely on the intrinsic probability of the case. Fortunately, we are able to show that gardens of Adonis, if we may use the expression in a general sense, are still planted, first by a primitive race at their sowing season, and second by European peasants at midsummer. Amongst the Oreons and Mandas of Bengal, when the time comes for planting out the rice which has been grown in seed beds, a party of young people of both sexes go to the forest and cut a young karma tree, or the branch of one. Bearing it in triumph, they return dancing, singing, and beating drums, and plant it in the middle of the village dancing ground. As sacrifice is offered to the tree, the next morning the youth of both sexes, linked arm in arm, dance in a great circle round the karma tree, which is decked with strips of coloured cloth and sham bracelets and necklets of plaited straw. As a preparation for the festival, the daughters of the headman of the village cultivate blades of barley in a peculiar way. The seed is sown in moist, sandy soil mixed with turmeric, and the blades sprout and unfold of a pale yellow or primrose colour. On the day of the festival, the girls take up these blades and carry them in baskets to the dancing crowd, where, prostrating themselves reverentially, they place some of the plants before the karma tree. Finally, the karma tree is taken away and thrown into a stream or tank. The meaning of planting these burly blades and then presenting them to the karma tree is hardly open to question. Trees are supposed to exercise a quickening influence upon the growth of crops, and amongst the very people in question, the Mandas or Mandaris, the grove deities are held responsible for the crops. Therefore, when at the season for planting out the rice, the Mandas bring in a tree and treat it with so much respect, their object can only be to foster thereby the growth of the rice which is about to be planted out, and the custom of causing barley blades to sprout rapidly and then presenting them to the tree must be intended to subserve the same purpose, perhaps by reminding the tree's spirit of his duty towards the crops, and stimulating his activity by this visible example of rapid vegetable growth. The throwing of the karma tree into the water is to be interpreted as a rain charm. Whether the barley blades are also thrown to the water is not said, but if my interpretation of the custom is right, probably they are so. A distinction between this Bengal custom and the Greek rites of Adonis is that in the former, the tree spirit appears in his original form as a tree, whereas in the Adonis worship he appears in human form, represented as a dead man, though his vegetable nature is indicated by the gardens of Adonis, which are, so to say, a secondary manifestation of his original power as a tree spirit. Gardens of Adonis in Rajputana. Gardens of Adonis are cultivated also by the Hindus with the intention apparently of ensuring the fertility both of the earth and of mankind. Thus at Odipur in Rajputana, a festival is held in honor of Gauri or Isani, the goddess of abundance, the Isis of Egypt, the Ceres of Greece, the Rajput Saturnalia, which it follows. It begins in the vernal equinox, when nature in these regions proximate to the tropic is in full expanse of her charms, and the matronly Gauri casts her golden mantle over the verdant Vasanti, personification of spring. Then the fruits exhibit their promise to the eye. The kohil fills the ear with melody, the air is impregnated with aroma, and the crimson poppy contrasts with the spikes of golden grain to form a wreath for the beneficent Gauri. Gauri is one of the names of Isa, or Parvati, wife of the greatest of the gods. Mahadeva, or Iswara, who is conjured with her in these rites, which almost exclusively appertain to the women. The meaning of Gauri is illo, emblematic of the ripened harvest, when the votaries of the goddess adore her effigies, which are those of a matron painted the colour of a ripe corn. The rites begin when the sun enters the sign of the ram, the opening of the Hindu year. An image of the goddess Gauri is made of earth, and a smaller one of her husband Iswara, and the two are placed together. A small trench is next dug, barley is sown in it, and the ground watered and heated artificially till the grain sprouts, when the women dance round it hand in hand, invoking the blessing of Gauri on their husbands. After that the young corn is taken up and distributed by the women to the men, who wear it in their turbans. Every wealthy family, or at least every subdivision of the city, has its own image. These and other rites, known only to the initiated, occupy several days and are performed within doors. Then the images of the goddess and her husband are decorated and borne in procession to a beautiful lake, whose deep blue waters mirror the cloudless Indian sky, marble palaces and orange groves. Here the women, their hair decked with roses and jessamine, carry the image of Gauri down a marble staircase to the water's edge, and dance round it singing hymns and love songs. Meantime, the goddess is supposed to bathe in the water. No men take part in this ceremony. Even the image of Iswara, the husband god, attracts a little attention. In these rites, the distribution of the barley shoots to the men, and the invocation of a blessing on their husbands by the wives point clearly to the desire of offspring as one motive for observing the custom. The same motive probably explains the use of gardens of Adonis at the marriage of Brahmins in the Madras presidency. Seeds of 5 or 9 sorts are mixed and sown in earthen pots, which are made specifically for the purpose and are filled with earth. Bride and bridegroom water the seeds both morning and evening for 4 days, and on the 5th day the seedlings are thrown, like the real gardens of Adonis, into a tank or river. Gardens of Adonis in northwestern and central India. In the Himalayan districts of northwestern India, the cultivators sow barley, maize, pulse, or mustard in a basket of earth on the 24th day of the 4th month, Asar, which falls about the middle of July. Then on the last day of the month, they place amidst the new sprouts small clay images of Mahadeo and Parvati, and worship them in remembrance of the marriage of those deities. Next day they cut down the green stalks and wear them in their headdresses. Similar is the barley feast known as Jai or Jawara in Upper India, and as Bujariya in the central provinces. On the 7th day of the light half of the month, Saiwan grains of barley are sown in a pot of manure, and spring up so quickly that by the end of the month the vessel is full of long, yellowish-green stalks. On the first day of the next month, Badon, the women and girls take the stalks out, throw the earth and manure into water, and distribute the plants among their male friends, who bind them in their turbans and about their dress. At Sargal in the central provinces of India, this ceremony is observed about the middle of September. None but women may take part in it, though crowds of men come to look on. Some little time before the festival, wheat or other grain has been sown in pots ingeniously constructed of large leaves, which are held together by the thorns of a species of acacia. Having grown up in the dark, the stalks are of a pale colour. On the day appointed, these gardens of Adonis, as we may call them, are carried towards a lake which abuts on the native city. The women of every family or circle of friends bring their own pots, and having laid them on the ground, they dance round them. Then, taking the pots of sprouting corn, they descend to the edge of the water, wash the soil away from the pots, and distribute the young plants among their friends. At the temple of the goddess Padmavati, near Padahapur, in the Bombay Presidency, a 9 nights festival is held in the bright half of the moon Ashvin, September-October. At this time a bamboo frame is hung in front of the image, and from it depend garlands of flowers and strings of wheaten cakes. Under the frame, the floor in front of the pedestal is strewn with a layer of earth in which wheat is sown and allowed to sprout. A similar rite is observed in the same month before the images of 2 other goddesses, Ambabai and Lakubai, who also have temples at Pandharpur. Gardens of Adonis in Bavaria, Gardens of Adonis on St. John's Day in Sardinia. In some parts of Bavaria, it is customary to sow flax in a pot on the last 3 days of the carnival. From the seed which grows best, an omen is drawn as to whether the early, the middle, or the late sowing will produce the best crop. In Sardinia, the Gardens of Adonis are still planted in connection with the great midsummer festival, which bears the name of St. John. At the end of March, or on the 1st of April, a young man of the village presents himself to a girl and asks her to be his compere, gossip or sweetheart, offering to be her compere. The invitation is considered as an honour by the girl's family and is gladly accepted. At the end of May, the girl makes a pot of the bark of corn tree, fills it with earth, and sows a handful of wheat and barley in it. The pot being placed in the sun and often watered, the corn sprouts rapidly and has a good head by Midsummer Eve, St. John's Eve, the 23rd of June. The pot is then called Erne, or Neneri. On St. John's Day, the young man and the girl, dressed in their best, accompanied by a long retinue and preceded by children gambolling and frolicking, move in procession to a church outside the village. Here they break the pot by throwing it against the door of the church. Then they sit down in a ring on the grass and eat eggs and herbs to the music of flutes. Wine is mixed in a cup and passed round, each one drinking as it passes. Then they join hands and sing Sweethearts of St. John, Compere di San Giovanni, over and over again, the flutes playing the while. When they tire of singing, they stand up and dance gaily in a ring till evening. This is the general Sardinian custom. As practiced at Ozeri, it has some special features. In May, the pots are made of cork bark and planted with corn, as already described. Then on the eve of St. John, the window sills are draped with rich clothes, on which the pots are placed, adorned with crimson and blue silk and ribbons of various colours. On each of the pots, they use formerly to place a statuette or cloth doll dressed as a woman, or a papyrus-like figure made of paste. But this custom, rigorously forbidden by the church, has fallen into disuse. The village swains go about in a troop to look at the pots and the decorations, and to wait for the girls, who assemble in the public square to celebrate the festival. Here a great bonfire is kindled, round which they dance and make merry. Those who wish to be sweethearts of St. John act as follows. The young man stands on one side of the bonfire and the girl on the other, and they, in a manner, join hands by each grasping one end of a long stick, which they pass 3 times backwards and forwards across the fire. Thus, thrusting their hands thrice rapidly into the flames, this seals their relationship to each other. Dancing and music go till late at night. The correspondence of these Sardinian pots of grain to the gardens of Adonis seem complete, and the images formerly placed in them answer to the images of Adonis which accompanied his gardens. Gardens of Adonis on St. John's Day in Sicily. Customs of the same sort are observed at the same season in Sicily. Pairs of boys and girls become gossips of St. John on St. John's Day by drawing each a hair from his or her head and performing various ceremonies over them. Thus they tie the hairs together and throw them up in the air, or exchange them over a potsherd, which they afterwards break in two, preserving each a fragment with pious care. The tie formed in the latter way is supposed to last for life. In some parts of Sicily, the gossips of St. John present each other with plates of sprouting corn, lentils, and canary seed, which have been planted 40 days before the festival. The one who receives the plate pulls the stalk of the young plants, binds it with a ribbon, and preserves it among his or her greatest treasures, restoring the platter to the giver. At Catania, the gossips exchange pots of basil and grated cucumbers. The girls tend the basil, and the thicker it grows, the more it is prized. In the Sardinian and Sicilian ceremonies, St. John may have taken the place of Adonis. Custom of bathing in water or washing in dew on the eve or day of St. John, Midsummer Eve or Midsummer Day. Petrarch Cologne on St. John's Eve. In the midsummer customs of Sardinia and Sicily, it is possible that, as Mr. R. Wooch supposes, St. John has replaced Adonis. We have seen that the rites of Tammuz or Adonis were commonly celebrated about midsummer. According to Jerome, their date was due. And besides their date and their similarity in respect to the pots of herbs and corn, there is another point of affinity between the two festivals, the heathen and the Christian. In both of them, water plays a prominent part. At his midsummer festival in Babylon, the image of Tammuz, whose name is said to mean true son of the deep water, was bathed with pure water. At his summer festival in Alexandria, the image of Adonis, with that of his divine mistress Aphrodite, was committed to the waves. And at the midsummer celebration in Greece, the gardens of Adonis were thrown into the sea or into springs. Now a great feature of the midsummer festival associated with the name of St. John is, or used to be, the custom of bathing in the sea, springs, rivers, or the dew on Midsummer Eve or the morning of Midsummer Day. Thus, for example, at Naples there is a church dedicated to St. John the Baptist under the name of St. John of the Sea, Es Giovan e Mer, and it was an old practice for men and women to bathe in the sea on St. John's Eve, that is, on Midsummer Eve, believing that thus all their sins were washed away. In the Abruzzi, water is still supposed to acquire certain marvellous and beneficial properties on St. John's night. They say that on that night the sun and moon bathe in the water. Hence many people take a bath in the sea or in a river at that season, especially at the moment of sunrise. At Castiglione in Casuria, they go before sunrise to the Pescara river or to springs, wash their faces and hands, then gird themselves with twigs of Bereni, Vitalba, and twine the plant around their brows, in order that they may be free from pains. At Persina, boys and girls watch each other's faces in a river or a spring, then exchange kisses and become gossips. The dew also that falls on St. John's night is supposed, in the Abruzzi, to benefit whatever it touches, whether it be water, flowers, or the human body. For that reason, people put out vessels of water on the window sills or the terraces and wash themselves with the water in the morning in order to purify themselves and escape headaches and colds. A still more efficacious mode of accomplishing the same end is to rise at the peep of dawn, to wet their hands in the dewy grass, and then to rub the moisture on the eyelids, the brow, and the temples, because the dew is believed to cure maladies of the head and eyes. It is also a remedy for diseases of the skin. Persons who are thus afflicted should roll on the dewy grass. When patients are prevented by their infirmity or any other cause from quitting the house, Their friends will gather the dew in sheets or tablecloths, and so apply it to the suffering part. At Marsala, in Sicily, there is a spring of water in a subterranean ghetto called the Grotto of the Sibyl. Beside it stands a church of St. John, which has been supposed to occupy the site of a temple of Apollo. On St. John's Eve, the 23rd of June, women and girls visit the grotto, and by drinking of the prophetic water, learn whether their husbands have been faithful to them in the year that is past, or whether they themselves will wed in the year that is to come. Sick people, too, imagine that by bathing in the water, drinking of it, or ducking thrice in it, in the name of the Trinity, they will be made whole. At Chiaramonte, in Sicily, the following custom is observed on St. John's Eve. The men repair to one fountain, and the women to another, and dip their heads thrice in the water, repeating at each ablution certain verses in honour of St. John. They believe that this is a cure or preventive of the scald. When Petrarch visited Cologne, he chanced to arrive in the town on St. John's Eve. The sun was nearly setting, and his host at once led him to the Rhine. A strange sight there met his eyes, for the banks of the river were covered with pretty women. The crowd was great but good-humoured. From a rising ground on which he stood, the poet saw many of the women, girded with fragrant herbs, kneel down on the water's edge, roll their sleeves up above their elbows, and wash their white arms and hands in a river, murmuring softly some words, which the Italian did not understand. He was told that the custom was a very old one, much honoured in the observance, for the common folk, especially the women, believed that to wash in the river on St. John's Eve would avert every misfortune in the coming year. On St. John's Eve, the people of Copenhagen used to go on pilgrimage to a neighbouring spring, there to heal and strengthen themselves in the water. In Spain, people still bathe in the sea or roll naked in the dew of the meadows on St. John's Eve, believing that this is a sovereign preservative against diseases of the skin. To roll in the dew on the morning of St. John's Day is also esteemed a cure for diseases of the skin in Normandy and Perigord. In Perigord, a field of hemp is especially recommended for the purpose, and the patient should rub himself with the plants on which he has rolled. At Ciotat, in Provence, while the midsummer bonfire blazed, young people used to plunge into the sea and splash each other vigorously. At Vétrolles, they bathed in a pond in order that they might not suffer the fever during the year, and at St. Mary's they watered the horses to protect them from the itch. A custom of drenching people on this occasion with water formerly prevailed in Toulon, Marseilles, and other towns of the south of France. The water was squirted from syringes, poured on the heads of passers-by from windows, and so forth. From Europe, the practice of bathing in rivers and springs on St. John's Day appears to have passed with the Spaniards to the New World. The custom of bathing at midsummer is pagan, not Christian, in its origin. It may perhaps be suggested that this widespread custom of bathing in water or dew on Midsummer Eve or Midsummer Day is purely Christian in origin, having been adopted as an appropriate mode of celebrating the day dedicated to the Baptist. But in point of fact, the custom is older than Christianity, for it was denounced and forbidden as a heathen practice by Augustine, and to this day it is practiced at midsummer by the Mohammedan peoples of North Africa. We may conjecture that the Church, unable to put down this relic of paganism, followed its usual policy of accommodation by bestowing on the right of a Christian name and acquiescing with a sigh in its observance, and casting about for a saint to supplant a heathen patron of bathing. The Christian doctors could hardly have hit upon a more appropriate successor than St. John the Baptist. Old heathen festival of midsummer in Europe and the East. But into whose shoes did the Baptist step? Was the displaced deity really Adonis, as the foregoing evidence seems to suggest? In Sardinia and Sicily it may have been so, for in these islands Semitic influence was certainly deep and probably lasting. The midsummer pastimes of Sardinian and Sicilian children may therefore be a direct continuation of the Carthaginian rites of Tammuz. Yet the midsummer festival seems too widely spread and too deeply rooted in Central and Northern Europe to allow us to trace it everywhere to an Oriental origin in general and to the cult of Adonis in particular. It has the air of a native of the soil rather than of an exotic import from the East. We shall do better, therefore, to suppose that at a remote period similar modes of thought, based on similar needs, led men independently in many distant lands, from the North Sea to the Euphrates, to celebrate the summer solstice with rites which, while they differed in some things, yet agreed closely in others, that in historical times a wave of Oriental influence, starting perhaps from Babylonia, carried the Tammuz or Adonis from the festival westward till it met with native forms of a similar festival, and that under pressure of the Roman civilization, these different yet kindred festivals fused with each other and crystallized into a variety of shapes, which subsisted more or less separately side by side, till the Church, unable to suppress them altogether, stripped them so far as it could of their grosser features, and dexterously changing the names, allowed them to pass muster as Christian. And what has just been said of the midsummer festivals probably applies, with the necessary modifications, to the spring festivals also. They too seem to have originated independently in Europe and the East, and after ages' separation to have amalgamated under the sway of the Roman Empire and the Christian Church. In Syria, as we have seen, there appears to have been a vernal celebration of Adonis, and we shall presently meet with an undoubted instance of an Oriental festival of spring in the rites of Attis. Meantime we must return for a little to the midsummer festival which goes by the name of St. John. Midsummer fires and midsummer couples in relation to vegetation. The Sardinian practice of making merry around a great bonfire on St. John's Eve is an instance of a custom which has been practiced at the midsummer festival from time immemorial in many parts of Europe. That custom has been more fully dealt with by me elsewhere. The instances which I have cited in other parts of this work seem to indicate a connection of the midsummer bonfire with vegetation. For example, both in Sweden and Bohemia, an essential part of the festival is the raising of the maypole or midsummer tree, which in Bohemia is burned in the bonfire. Again, in a Russian midsummer ceremony, a straw figure of Kupalo, the representative of vegetation, is placed beside a maypole or midsummer tree and then carried to and fro across the bonfire. Kupalo is here represented in duplicate, in tree form by the midsummer tree, and in human form by the straw effigy, just as Adonis was represented both by an image and a garden of Adonis, and the duplicate representatives of Kupalo, like those of Adonis, are finally cast into water. In the Sardinian Sicilian customs, the gossips or sweethearts of St. John probably answer, on the one hand, to Adonis and Astarte, on the other, to the King and Queen of May. In the Swedish province of Blekinge, part of the midsummer festival is the election of a midsummer bride, who chooses her bridegroom. A collection is made for the pair, who for the time being are looked upon as man and wife. Such midsummer pairs may be supposed, like the May pairs, to stand for the powers of vegetation or of fertility in general. They represent the flesh and blood what the images of Siva Amadio and Parvati in the Indian ceremonies, and the images of Adonis and Aphrodite in the Alexandrian ceremony set forth in effigy. Gardens of Adonis intended to foster the growth of vegetation, and especially of the crops. Modes of divination at midsummer, like the gardens of Adonis. The reason why ceremonies, whose aim is to foster the growth of vegetation, should thus be associated with bonfires, why in particular the representative of vegetation should be burned in the likeness of a tree, or passed across the fire in effigy, or in the form of a living couple, has been discussed by me elsewhere. Here it is enough to have adduced evidence of such association, and therefore to have obviated the objection which might have been raised to my theory of the Sardinian custom, on the ground that the bonfires have nothing to do with vegetation. One more piece of evidence may here be given to prove the contrary. In some parts of Germany and Austria, young men and girls leap over midsummer bonfires for the express purpose of making the hemp or flax grow tall. We may therefore assume that in the Sardinian custom, the blades of wheat and barley which are forced on in pots for the midsummer festival, and which correspond so closely to the gardens of Adonis, form one of those widely spread summer ceremonies, the original object of which was to promote the growth of vegetation, and especially of the crops. But as, by an easy extension of ideas, the spirit of vegetation was believed to exercise a beneficent and fertilizing influence on human as well as animal life, the gardens of Adonis would be supposed, like the May trees or May boughs, to bring good luck, and more particularly perhaps offspring, to the family or to the person who planted them, and even after the idea had been abandoned that they operate actively to confer prosperity, they might still be used to furnish omens of good or evil. It is thus that magic dwindles into a divination. Accordingly, we find modes of divination practiced at midsummer which resemble more or less closely the gardens of Adonis. Thus an anonymous Italian writer of the 16th century has recorded that it was customary to sow barley and wheat a few days before the festival of St. John, Midsummer Day, and also before that of St. Vitus. And it was believed that the person for whom they were sown would be fortunate, and get a good husband or a good wife, if the grain sprouted well, but if it sprouted ill, he or she would be unlucky. In various parts of Italy and all over Sicily, it is still custom to put plants in water or in earth on the eve of St. John, and from the manner in which they are found to be blooming or fading on St. John's Day, omens are drawn, especially as to fortune and love. Amongst the plants used for this purpose are Sciuri di Esquiavani, St. John's wort, and nettles. In Prussia 200 years ago, the farmers used to send out their servants, especially their maids, to gather St. John's wort on Midsummer's Eve, or Midsummer Day, St. John's Day. When they had fetched it, the farmer took as many plants as there were persons, and struck them in the wall or between the beams. And it was thought that he or she whose plant did not bloom would soon fall sick or die. The rest of the plants were tied in a bundle, fastened to the end of a pole, and set up at the gate or wherever the corn would be brought in at the next harvest. The bundle was called Cupole. The ceremony was known as Cupole's Festival, and at it the farmer prayed for a good crop of hay and so forth. The Prussian custom is particularly notable, inasmuch as it strongly confirms the opinion that Cupalo, doubtless identical with Cupole, was originally a deity of vegetation. For here Cupalo is represented by a bundle of plants specially associated with midsummer in folk custom, and her influence over vegetation is plainly signified by placing her vegetable emblem over the place where the harvest is brought in, as well as by the prayers for a good crop which are uttered on the occasion. This furnishes a fresh argument in support of the view that the death, whose analogy to Cupalo, Irillo, and the rest I have shown elsewhere, originally personified vegetation, more especially the dying or dead vegetation of winter. Further, my interpretation of the gardens of Adonis is confirmed by finding that in this Prussian custom the various same kinds of plants is used to form the gardens of Adonis, as we may call them, and the image of the deity. Nothing could set in a stronger light the truth of the theory that the gardens of Adonis are merely another manifestation of the god himself. Sicilian gardens of Adonis in spring. In Sicily, gardens of Adonis are still sown in spring as well as in summer, from which we may perhaps infer that Sicily, as well as Syria, celebrated of old a vernal festival of the dead and risen god. At the approach of Easter, Sicilian women sow wheat, lentils, and canary seed in plates, which they keep in the dark and water every 2 days. The plants soon shoot up, the stalks are tied together with red ribbons, and the plates containing them are placed on the sepulchres, which, with the effigies of the dead Christ, are made up in Catholic and Greek churches on Good Friday, just as the gardens of Adonis were placed on the grave of the dead Adonis. The practice is not confined to Sicily, for it is observed also at Cosenza in Calabria, and perhaps in other places. The whole custom, sepulchres as well as plates of sprouting grain, may be nothing but a continuation, under a different name, of the worship of Adonis. Resemblance of the Easter ceremonies in the Greek Church to the rites of Adonis. Nor are these Sicilian and Calabrian customs the only Easter ceremonies which resemble the rites of Adonis. During the whole of Good Friday, a waxen effigy of the dead Christ is exposed to view in the middle of the Greek churches, and is covered with fervent kisses by the thronging crowd, while the whole church rings with melancholy, monotonous dirges. Late in the evening, when it has grown quite dark, This waxen image is carried by the priests into the street on a bier adorned with lemons, roses, jessamine, and other flowers, and there begins the grand procession of the multitude, who moves in serried ranks with slow and solemn step through the whole town. Every man carries his taper and breaks out into doleful lamentation. At all the houses which the procession passes there are seated women with censers to fumigate the marching host. Thus the community solemnly buries its Christ as if he had just died. At last the waxen image is again deposited in the church, and the same lugubrious chants echo anew. These lamentations, accompanied by a strict fast, continue till midnight on Saturday. As the clock strikes 12, the bishop appears and announces the glad tidings that Christ is risen, to which the crowd replies, "He is risen indeed," and at once the whole city bursts into an uproar of joy, which finds vent in shrieks and shouts, in the endless discharge of carronades and muskets, and the explosion of fireworks of every sort. In the very same hour, people plunge from the extremity of the fast into the enjoyment of the Easter lamb and neat wine. Resemblance of the Easter ceremonies in the Catholic Church to the rites of Adonis. In like manner, the Catholic Church has been accustomed to bring forth its followers in a visible form the death and resurrection of the Redeemer. Such sacred dramas are well fitted to impress the lively imagination and to stir the warm feelings of a susceptible southern race, to whom the pomp and pageantry of Catholicism are more congenial than to the colder temperament of the Teutonic peoples. The solemnities observed in Sicily on Good Friday, the official anniversary of the crucifixion, are thus described by a native Sicilian writer. A truly moving ceremony is the procession which always takes place in the evening in every commune of Sicily, and further the deposition from the cross. The brotherhoods took part in the procession, and the rear was brought up by a great many boys and girls representing saints both male and female, and carrying the emblems of Christ's passion. The deposition from the cross was managed by the priests. The coffin with the dead Christ in it was flanked by Jews armed with swords, an object of horror and aversion in the midst of the profound pity excited by the sight not only of Christ but of the Mater Dolorosa, who followed behind him. Now and then the mysteries, with symbols of the crucifixion, went in front. Sometimes the procession followed 3 hours of agony and the deposition from the cross. The 3 hours commemorated those which Jesus Christ passed upon the cross. Beginning at the 18th and ending at the 21st hour of Italian time, 2 priests preached alternately on the Passion. Anciently, the sermons were delivered in the open air on the place called the Calvary. At last, when the 3rd hour was about to strike, at the words "Emisit Spiritum," Christ died, bowing his head amid the sobs and tears of the bystanders. Immediately afterwards, in some places, 3 hours afterwards in each, the sacred body was unnailed and deposited in the coffin. In Castelnuovo, at the Ave Maria, 2 priests clad as Jews, representing Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, with their servants in costume, repaired to the Calvary, preceded by the company of the whites. There, with doleful verses and chants appropriate to the occasion, they performed all the various operations of the deposition, after which the procession took its way to the larger church. In Sella Peruta, the Calvary is erected in the church. At the preaching of the death, the crucified is made to bow his head by means of machinery, while the guns are fired, trumpets sound, and amid the silence of the people impressed by the death of the Redeemer, the strains of a melancholy funeral march are heard. Christ is removed from the cross and deposited in the coffin by 3 priests. After the procession of the dead Christ, the burial is performed. That is, 2 priests lay Christ in a fictitious sepulchre, from which, at the Mass of Easter Sunday, the image of the risen Christ issues and is elevated upon the altar by means of machinery. Scenic representations of the same sort, with variations of detail, are exhibited at Easter in the Abruzzi, and probably in many other parts of the Catholic world. The Christian festival of Easter, perhaps grafted on a festival of Adonis. When we reflect how often the Church has skillfully contrived to plant the seeds of a new faith on the old stock of paganism, we may surmise that the Easter celebration of the dead and risen Christ was grafted upon a similar celebration of the dead and risen Adonis, which, as we have seen reason to believe, was celebrated in Syria at the same season. The type created by Greek artists of the sorrowful goddess with her dying lover in her arms resembles and may have been the model of the Pietà of Christian art, the Virgin with the dead body of her divine Son in her lap, of which the most celebrated example is one by Michelangelo in St. Peter's. That noble group in which the living sorrow of the mothers contrasts so wonderfully with the languor of death in the Son is one of the finest compositions in marble. Ancient Greek art has bequeathed to us few works so beautiful and none so pathetic. The worship of Adonis at Bethlehem, the morning star identified with Venus, may have been the signal for the festival of Adonis, the Star of Bethlehem. In this connection, a well-known statement of Jerome may not be without significance. He tells us that Bethlehem, the traditionary birthplace of the Lord, was shaded by a grove of that still old Assyrian lord Adonis, and that where the infant Jesus had wept, the lover of Venus was bewailed. Though he does not expressly say so, Jerome seems to have thought that the grove of Adonis had been planted by the heathen after the birth of Christ for that purpose of defiling the sacred spot. In this he may have been mistaken. If Adonis was indeed, as I have argued, the spirit of the corn, a more suitable name for his dwelling place could hardly be found than Bethlehem, the house of bread, and he may well have been worshipped there at his house of bread long ages before the birth of him who said, I am the bread of life. Even on the hypothesis that Adonis followed rather than preceded Christ at Bethlehem, the choice of his sad figure to divert the allegiance of Christians from their Lord cannot but strike us as eminently appropriate when we remember the similarity of the rites which commemorated the death and resurrection of the two. One of the earliest seats of the worship of the new god was Antioch, and at Antioch, as we have seen, the death of the old god was annually celebrated with great solemnity. A circumstance which attended the entrance of Julian into the city at the time of the Adonis festival may perhaps throw some light on the date of its celebration. When the emperor drew near to the city, he was received with public prayers as if he had been a god, and he marvelled at the voices of a great multitude who cried that the star of salvation had dawned upon them in the east. This may doubtless have been no more than a fulsome compliment paid by an obsequious oriental crowd to the Roman emperor. But it is also possible that the rising of a bright star regularly gave the signal for the festival, and that as chance would have it, the star emerged above the rim of the eastern horizon at the very moment of the emperor's approach. The coincidence, if it happened, could hardly fail to strike the imagination of a superstitious and excited multitude, who might thereupon hail the great man as a deity whose coming was announced by the sign in the heavens. Or the emperor may have mistaken for a greeting to himself the shouts which were addressed to the star. Now Astarte, the divine mistress of Adonis, was identified with the planet Venus, and her changes from a morning to an evening star were carefully noted by the Babylonian astronomers, who drew omens from her alternate appearance and disappearance. Hence we may conjecture that the festival of Adonis was regularly timed to coincide with the appearance of Venus as a morning or evening star. But the star which the people of Antioch saluted at the festival was seen in the east, therefore, if it was indeed Venus, it can only have been the morning star. At Apheka in Syria, where there was a famous temple of Astarte, the signal for the celebration of the rites was apparently given by the flashing of a meteor, which on a certain day fell like a star from the top of Mount Lebanon into the river Adonis. The meteor was thought to be Astarte herself, and in its flight through the air might naturally be interpreted as the descent of the amorous goddess into the arms of her lover. At Antioch and elsewhere, the appearance of the morning star on the day of the festival may in like manner have been hailed as the coming of the goddess of love to wake her dead leman from his earthly bed. If that were so, we may surmise that it was the morning star which guided the wise men of the east to Bethlehem, the hallowed spot which heard, in the language of Jerome, the weeping of the infant Christ and the lament for Adonis. End of section 12. Section 13 of the Golden Bough, A Study in Magic and Religion, Part 4, Adonis-Attis-Osiris, Volume 1, by Sir James George Frazer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Book 2nd, Attis. Chapter 1, The Myth and Ritual of Attis. Attis, the Phrygian counterpart of his Adonis, his relation to Cybele, his miraculous birth, the death of Attis. Another of those gods whose supposed death and resurrection struck such deep roots into the faith and ritual of Western Asia is Attis. He was to Phrygia what Adonis was to Syria. Like Adonis, he appears to have been a god of vegetation, and his death and resurrection were annually mourned and rejoiced over at festival in spring. The legends and rites of the two gods were so much alike that the ancients themselves sometimes identified them. Attis was said to have been a fair young shepherd or herdsman beloved by Cybele, the mother of the gods, a great Asiatic goddess of fertility, who had her chief home in Phrygia. Some held that Attis was her son. His birth, like that of many other heroes, is said to have been miraculous. His mother, Nana, was a virgin, who conceived by putting a ripe almond or a pomegranate in her bosom. Indeed, in the Phrygian cosmogony, an almond figured as the father of all things. Perhaps because its delicate lilac blossom is one of the first heralds of the spring, appearing on the bare boughs before the leaves have opened. Such tales of virgin mothers are relics of an age of childish ignorance when men had not yet recognized the intercourse of the sexes as a true cause of offspring. That ignorance still shared by the lowest of existing savages, the Aboriginal tribes of Central Australia, was doubtless at one time universal among mankind. Even in latter times, when people are better acquainted with the laws of nature, they sometimes imagine that these laws may be subject to exceptions, and that miraculous beings may be born in miraculous ways by women who have never known a man. In Palestine to this day, it is believed that a woman may conceive by a jinni or by the spirit of her dead husband. There is, or was lately, a man at Nebk who is currently supposed to be the offspring of such a union, and the simple folk have never suspected his mother's virtue. Two different accounts of the death of Attis were current. According to one, he was killed by a boar, like Adonis. According to the other, he unmanned himself under a pine tree, and bled to death on the spot. The latter is said to have been the local story told by the people of Pessinus, a great seat of the worship of Cybele, and the whole legend of which the story forms a part is stamped with a character of rudeness and savagery that speaks strongly for its antiquity. Both tales might claim the support of custom, or rather both were probably inverted to explain certain customs observed by the worshippers. The story of the self-mutilation of Attis is clearly an attempt to account for the self-mutilation of his priests, who regularly castrated themselves on entering the service of the goddess. The story of his death by the boar may have been told to explain why his worshippers, especially the people of Pessinus, abstained from eating swine. In like manner, the worshippers of Adonis abstained from pork, because a boar had killed their god. After his death, Attis is said to have been changed into a pine tree. Worship of Cybele introduced into Rome in 204 BC. The worship of the Phrygian mother of the gods was adopted by the Romans in 204 BC towards the close of their long struggle with Hannibal, for their drooping spirits had been opportunely cheered by a prophecy alleged to be drawn from that convenient farrago of nonsense, the Sibylline books, that the foreign invader would be driven from Italy if the great Oriental goddess were brought to Rome. Accordingly, ambassadors were dispatched to her sacred city, Pessinus, in Phrygia. The small black stone which embodied the mighty divinity was entrusted to them and conveyed to Rome, where it was received with great respect and installed in the Temple of Victory on the Palatine Hill. It was the middle of April when the goddess arrived, and she went to work at once, for the harvest that year was such as had not been seen for many a long day, and the very next year Hannibal and his veterans embarked for Africa. As he looked his last on the coast of Italy fading behind him in the distance, he could not foresee that Europe, which had repelled the arms, would yet yield to the gods of the Orient. The vanguard of the conquerors had already encamped in the heart of Italy before the rearguard of the beaten army fell suddenly back from its shores. Attis and his eunuch priests, the Galli at Rome. We may conjecture, though we are not told, that the mother of the gods brought with her the worship of her youthful lover or son to a new home in the West. Certainly the Romans were familiar with the Galli, the emasculated priests of Attis before the close of the Republic. These unsexed beings in their oriental costume, with little images suspended on their breasts, appear to have been a familiar sight in the streets of Rome, which they traversed in procession, carrying the image of the goddess and chanting their hymns to the music of cymbals and tambourines, flutes and horns, while the people, impressed by the fantastic show and moved by the wild strains, flung alms to them in abundance, and buried the images and its bearers under showers of roses. A further step was taken by the Emperor Claudius when he incorporated the Phrygian worship of the sacred tree, and with it probably the orgiastic rites of Attis, in the established religion of Rome. The great spring festival of Cybele and Attis is best known to us in the form in which it was celebrated at Rome. But as we are informed that the Roman ceremonies were also Phrygian, we may assume that they differed hardly, if at all, from their Asiatic original. The order of the festival seems to have been as follows. The spring festival of Cybele and Attis at Rome, the Day of Blood. On the 22nd day of March, a pine tree was cut in the woods and brought into the sanctuary of Cybele, where it was treated as a great divinity. The duty of carrying the sacred tree was entrusted to a guild of tree-bearers. The trunk was swathed like a corpse with wooden bands and decked with wreaths of violets, for violets were said to have sprung from the blood of Attis, as roses and anemones from the blood of Adonis, and the effigy of a young man, doubtless Attis himself, was tied to the middle of the stem. On the second day of the festival, the 23rd of March, the chief ceremony seems to have been a blowing of trumpets. The third day, the 24th of March, was known as the Day of Blood. The archigallus or high priest drew blood from his arms and presented it as an offering. Nor was he alone in making this bloody sacrifice. Stirred by the wild barbaric music of clashing cymbals, rumbling drums, droning horns, and screaming flutes, the inferior clergy whirled about in the dance with waggling heads and streaming hair, until, wrapped into a frenzy of excitement and insensible to pain, they gashed their bodies with potsherds or slashed them with knives in order to bespatter the altar and the sacred tree with their flowing blood. The ghastly rite probably formed part of the mourning for Attis, and may have been intended to strengthen him for the resurrection. The Australian Aborigines cut themselves in like manner over the graves of their friends for the purpose, perhaps, of nailing them to be born again. Further, we may conjecture, though we are not expressly told, that it was on the same day of blood and for the same purpose that the novices sacrificed their virility. Wrought up to the highest pitch of religious excitement, they dashed the severed portions of themselves against the image of this cruel goddess. These broken instruments of fertility were afterwards reverently wrapped up and buried in the earth or in subterranean chambers sacred to Cybele, where, like the offering of blood, they may have been deemed instrumental in recalling Attis to life and hastening the general resurrection of nature, which was then bursting into leaf and blossom in the vernal sunshine. Some confirmation of this conjecture is furnished by the savage story that the mother of Attis conceived by putting in her bosom a pomegranate sprung from the severed genitals of a man-monster named Agdestis, a sort of double of Attis. Eunuch priests in the service of Asiatic goddesses. If there is any truth in this conjectural explanation of the custom, we can readily understand why other Asiatic goddesses of fertility were served in like manner by eunuch priests. These feminine deities required to receive from their male ministers, who personated the divine lovers, the means of discharging their beneficent functions. They had themselves to be impregnated by the life-giving energy before they could transmit it to the world. Goddesses thus ministered by the eunuch priests were the great Artemis of Ephesus and the great Syrian Astarte of Hierapolis, whose sanctuary, frequented by swarms of pilgrims and enriched by the offerings of Assyria and Babylonia, of Arabia and Phoenicia, was perhaps in the days of its glory the most popular in the East. Now the unsexed priests of this Syrian goddess resembled those of Cybele so closely that some people took them to be the same, and the mode in which they dedicated themselves to the religious life was similar. The great festival of the year at Hierapolis fell at the beginning of spring, when multitudes thronged to the sanctuary from Syria and the regions round about. While the flutes played, the drums beat, and the eunuch priests slashed themselves with knives, the religious excitement gradually spread like a wave among the crowd of onlookers, and many a one did that which he little thought to do when he came as a holiday spectator to the festival. For man after man, his veins throbbing with the music, his eyes fascinated by the sight of the streaming blood, flung his garments from him, leapt forth with a shout, and seizing one of the swords which stood ready for the purpose, castrated himself on the spot. Then he ran through the city, holding the bloody pieces in his hand, till he threw them into one of the houses which he passed in his mad career. The household thus honoured had furnished him with a suit of female attire and female ornaments, which he wore for the rest of his life. When the tumult of emotion had subsided, and the man had come to himself again, the irrevocable sacrifice must often have been followed by passionate sorrow and lifelong regret. This revulsion of natural human feeling after the frenzies of fanatical religion is powerfully depicted by Catullus in a celebrated poem. The Sacrifice of Virility, the Mourning for Attis. The parallel of these Syrian devotees confirms the view that in the similar worship of Cybele, the sacrifice of virility took place on the Day of Blood at the vernal rites of the goddess, when the violets, supposed to spring from the red drops of her wounded lover, were in bloom among the pines. Indeed, the story that Attis unmanned himself under a pine tree was clearly devised to explain why his priests did the same beside the sacred violet-wreathed tree at his festival. At all events, we can hardly doubt that the Day of Blood witnessed the mourning for Attis over an effigy of him which was afterwards buried. The image thus laid in the sepulchre was probably the same which had hung upon the tree. Throughout the period of mourning, the worshippers fasted from bread, normally because Cybele had done so in her grief for the death of Attis, but really perhaps for the same reason which induced the women of Haran to abstain from eating anything ground in a mill while they wept for Tammuz. To partake of bread or flour at such a season might have been deemed a wanton profanation of the bruised and broken body of the god, or the fast may possibly have been a preparation for a sacramental meal. Festival of Joy, Hilaria, for the resurrection of Attis on March 25th, the procession to the Elmo. But when night had fallen, the sorrow of the worshippers was turned to joy, for suddenly a light shone in the darkness. The tomb was opened, the god had risen from the dead, and as the priest touched the lips of the weeping mourners with balm, he softly whispered in their ears the glad tidings of salvation. The resurrection of the god was hailed by his disciples as a promise that they too would issue triumphant from the corruption of the grave. On the morrow, the 25th day of March, which was reckoned the vernal equinox, the divine resurrection was celebrated with a wild outburst of glee. At Rome and probably elsewhere, the celebration took the form of a carnival. It was the festival of joy, Hilaria. A universal license prevailed. Every man might say and do what he pleased. People went about the streets in disguise. No dignity was too high or too sacred for the humblest citizen to assume with impunity. In the reign of Commodus, a band of conspirators thought to take advantage of the masquerade by dressing in the uniform of the imperial guard, and so, mingling with a crowd of merrymakers, to get within stabbing distance of the emperor. But the plot miscarried. Even the stern Alexander Severus used to relax so far on the joyous day as to admit of a pheasant to his frugal board. The next day, the 26th of March, was given to repose, which must have been much needed after the varied excitements and fatigues of the preceding days. Finally, the Roman festival closed on the 27th of March with a procession to the Brook Almo. The silver image of the goddess, with its face of jagged black stone, sat in a wagon drawn by oxen. Preceded by the nobles, walking barefoot, it moved slowly to the loud music of pipes and tambourines, out by the Porta Capena, and so down to the banks of the Almo, which flowed into the Tobo just below the walls of Rome. There the high priest, robed in purple, washed the wagon, the image, and the other sacred objects in the water of the stream. On returning from their bath, the wain and the oxen were strewn with fresh spring flowers. All was mirth and gaiety. No one thought of the blood that had flowed so lately. Even the Huguenot priests forgot their wounds. The mysteries of Attis, the sacrament, the baptism of blood, the Vatican, a centre of the worship of Attis. Such then appears to have been the annual solemnization of the death and resurrection of Attis in spring. But besides these public rites, his worship is known to have comprised certain sacred or mystic ceremonies, which probably aimed at bringing the worshipper, and especially the novice, into closer communication with his god. Our information as to the nature of these mysteries and the date of their celebration is unfortunately very scanty, but they seem to have included a sacramental meal and a baptism of blood. In the sacrament, the novice became a partaker of the mysteries by eating out of a drum and drinking out of a cymbal, two instruments of music which figured prominently in the thrilling orchestra of Attis. The fast which accompanied the mourning for the dead god may perhaps have been designed to prepare the body of the communicant for the reception of the blessed sacrament of purging it of all that could defile by contact the sacred elements. In the baptism, the devotee, crowned with gold and wreathed with fillets, descended into a pit, the mouth of which was covered with a wooden grating. A bull, adorned with garlands of flowers, its forehead glittering with gold leaf, was then driven onto the grating and there stabbed to death with a consecrated spear. Its hot, reeking blood poured in torrents through the apertures, and was received with devout eagerness by the worshipper on every part of his person and garments, till he emerged from the pit, drenched, dripping, and scarlet from head to foot, to receive the homage, nay, the adoration of his fellows, as one who has been born again into eternal life and had washed away his sins in the blood of the bull. For some time afterwards, the fiction of a new birth was kept up by dieting him on milk like a newborn babe. The regeneration of the worshipper took place at the same time as the regeneration of his god, namely at the vernal equinox. At Rome, the new birth and his remission of sins by the shedding of bull's blood appeared to have been carried out above all at the sanctuary of the Phrygian goddess on the Vatican Hill, or at near the spot where the great Basilica of St. Peter's now stands, for many inscriptions relating to the rites were found when the church was being enlarged in 1608 or 1609. From the Vatican as a centre, this barbarous system of superstition seems to have spread to other parts of the Roman Empire. Inscriptions found in Gaul and Germany prove that provincial sanctuaries modelled their ritual on that of the Vatican. From the same source we learn that the testicles, as well as the blood of the bull, played an important part in the ceremonies. Probably they were regarded as a powerful charm to promote fertility and hasten the new birth. End of section 13. Section 14. Of the Golden Bough, A Study in Magic and Religion. Part 4. Religion-Adonis-Attis-Osiris, Volume 1, by Sir James George Frazer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Chapter 2. Attis as a God of Vegetation. The sanctity of the pine tree in the worship of Attis. The original character of Attis as a tree spirit is brought out plenty by the part which the pine tree plays in his legend, his ritual, and his monuments. The story that he was a human being transformed into a pine tree is only one of those transparent attempts at rationalizing old beliefs which meet us so frequently in mythology. The bringing in of the pine tree from the woods, decked with violets and woolen bands, is like bringing in the May tree or summer tree in modern folk custom, and the effigy which was attached to the pine tree was only a duplicate representative of the tree spirit Attis. After being fastened to the tree, the effigy was kept for a year and then burned. The same thing appears to have been sometimes done with the maypole, and in like manner the effigy of the corn spirit made at harvest is often preserved till it is replaced by a new effigy at next year's harvest. The original intention of such customs was no doubt to maintain the spirit of vegetation in life throughout the year. Why the Phrygians should have worshipped the pine above other trees we can only guess. Perhaps the sight of its changeless, though sombre green cresting, the ridges of the high hills above the fading splendour of the autumn woods in the valleys may have seemed to their eyes to mark it out as a seat of a diviner life, of something exempt from the sad vicissitudes of the seasons, constant and eternal as a sky which stooped to meet it. For the same reason, perhaps, ivy was sacred to Attis. At all events, we read that his eunuch priests were tattooed with a pattern of ivy leaves. Another reason for the sanctity of the pine may have been its usefulness. The cones of the stone pine contain edible nut-like seeds which have been used as food since antiquity, and are still eaten, for example, by the poorer classes in Rome. Moreover, a wine was brewed from these seeds, and this may partly account for the orgiastic nature of the rites of Cybele, which the ancients compared with those of Dionysus. Further, pine cones were regarded as symbols, or rather instruments of fertility. Hence at the festival of the Thesmophoria, they were thrown, along with pigs and other agents or emblems of fecundity, into the sacred vaults of Demeter for the purpose of quickening the ground and the wombs of women. Attis as a corn god, Cybele as a goddess of fertility, the bathing of her image either a rain charm or a marriage rite. Like tree spirits in general, Attis was apparently thought to wield power over the fruits of the earth, or even to be identical with the corn. One of his epithets was very fruitful. He was addressed as the reaped green or yellow ear of corn, and the story of his sufferings, death, and resurrection was interpreted as the ripe grain wounded by the reaper, buried in the granary, and coming to life again when it is sown in the ground. A statue of him in the Lateran Museum at Rome clearly indicates his relation to the fruits of the earth, and particularly to the corn, for it represents him with a bunch of ears of corn and fruit in his hand, and a wreath of pine cones, pomegranates, and other fruits on his head, while from the top of his Phrygian cap ears of corn are sprouting. On a stone urn which contained the ashes of an archigallus or high priest of Attis, the same idea is expressed in a slightly different way. The top of the urn is adorned with ears of corn carved in relief, and it is surmounted by a figure of a cock whose tail consists of ears of corn. Cybele in like manner was conceived as a goddess of fertility who could make or mar the fruits of the earth, for the people of Augustodunum, Autun, in Gaul, used to cart her image about in a wagon for the good of the fields and vineyards, while they danced and sang before it. And we have seen that in Italy an unusually fine harvest was attributed to the recent arrival of the Great Mother. The bathing of the image of the goddess in a river may well have been a rain charm to ensure an abundant supply of moisture for the crops, or perhaps, as Mr. Hepting has suggested, the union of Cybele and Attis, like that of Aphrodite and Adonis, was dramatically represented at the festival, and the subsequent bath of the goddess was a ceremonial purification of the bride, such as is often observed at human marriages. In like manner, Aphrodite is said to have bathed after her union with Adonis, and so did Demeter after her intercourse with Poseidon. Hera washed in the springs of the river Bough after her marriage with Zeus, and every year she recovered her virginity by bathing in the spring of Canathus. However that may be, the rules of diet observed by the worshippers of Cybele and Attis and their solemn fasts are clearly dictated by a belief that the divine life in these deities manifested itself in the fruits of the earth, and especially in such of them as are actually hidden by the soil. For while the devotees were allowed to partake of flesh, though not of pork or fish, they were forbidden to eat seeds and the roots of vegetables, but they might eat the stalks and upper parts of the plants. Chapter 3. Attis as the Father God. The name Attis seems to mean father. The name Attis appears to mean simply father. This explanation, suggested by etymology, is confirmed by the observation that another name for Attis was Pappus. For Pappus has all the appearance of being a common form of that word for father, which occurs independently in many distinct families of speech all the world over. Similarly, the mother of Attis was named Nana, which is itself a form of the worldwide word for mother. The immense list of short words collected by Beschermann shows that the types pa and ta, with the familiar forms ap and at, preponderate in the world as names for father, while ma and na, am, and an preponderate as names for mother. Relation of Attis to the mother goddess. Attis as a sky god or heavenly father. Stories of the emasculation of the sky god. Thus the mother of Attis is only another form of his divine mistress, the great mother goddess, and we are brought back to the myth that the lovers were mother and son. The story that Nana conceived miraculously without commerce with the other sex shows that the mother goddess of Virgia herself was viewed, like other goddesses of the same primitive type, as a virgin mother. The view of her character does not rest on a perverse and mischievous theory that virginity is more honourable than matrimony. It is derived, as I have already indicated, from a state of savagery in which the mere fact of paternity was unknown. That explains why in latter times, long after the true nature of paternity had been ascertained, the father god was often a much less important personage in mythology than his divine partner, the mother goddess. With regard to Attis in his paternal character, it deserves to be noticed that the Bithynians used to ascend to the tops of the mountains and there call upon him under the name of Pappus. The custom is attested by Arrian, who, as a native of Bithynia, must have had good opportunities of observing it. We may perhaps infer from it that the Bithynians conceived Attis as a sky god or heavenly father, like Zeus, with whom indeed Arrian identifies him. If that were so, the story of the loves of Attis and Cybele, the father god and the mother goddess, might be in one of its aspects a particular version of the widespread myth which represents Mother Earth fertilized by Father Sky, and further the story of the emasculation of Attis would be parallel to the Greek legend that Cronus castrated his father, the old sky god Uranus, and was himself in turn castrated by his own son, the younger sky god Zeus. The tale of the mutilation of the sky god by his son has been plausibly explained as a myth of the violent separation of the earth and sky, which some races, for example the Polynesians, suppose to have originally clasped each other in a close embrace. Yet it seems unlikely that an order of eunuch priests like the Galli should have been based on a purely cosmogonic myth. Why should they continue for all time to be mutilated because the sky god was so in the beginning? The custom of castration must surely have been designed to meet a constantly recurring need, not merely to reflect a mythical event which happened at the creation of the world. Such a need is a maintenance of the fruitfulness of the earth, annually imperilled by the changes of the seasons. Yet the theory that the mutilation of the priests of Attis and the burial of the severed parts were designed to fertilize the ground may perhaps be reconciled with the cosmogonic myth, if we remember the old opinion, held apparently by many peoples, that the creation of the world is year by year repeated in that great transformation which depends ultimately on the annual increase of the sun's heat. However, the evidence for the celestial aspect of Attis is too slight to allow us to speak with any confidence on the subject. A trace of that aspect appears to survive in the star-spangled cap which he is said to have received from Cybele, and which is figured on some monuments supposed to represent him. His identification with the Phrygian moon god Men Tyrannus points in the same direction. but is probably due rather to the religious speculation of the latter age than a genuine popular tradition. Chapter 4. Human Representatives of Attis. The High Priest of Attis bore the god's name and seems to have personated him. The drawing of the High Priest's blood may have been a substitute for putting him to death in the character of the god. The name of Attis in the royal families of Phrygia and Lydia. The Phrygian priests of Attis may have been members of the royal family. From inscriptions it appears that both at Pessinus and Rome, the High Priestess Cybele regularly bore the name of Attis. It is therefore a reasonable conjecture that he played the part of his namesake, the legendary Attis, at the annual festival. We have seen that on the Day of Blood, he drew blood from his arms, and this may have been an imitation of the self-inflicted death of Attis under the pine tree. It is not inconsistent with this supposition that Attis was also represented at these ceremonies by an effigy. For instances, it can be shown in which the divine being is being represented by a living person, and afterwards by an effigy, which is then burnt or otherwise destroyed. Perhaps we may go a step further and conjecture that this mimic killing of the priest, accompanied by a real effusion of his blood, was in Phrygia, as it has been elsewhere, a substitute for a human sacrifice which in earlier times was actually offered. Sir W. M. Ramsay, whose authority on all questions relating to Phrygia no one will dispute, is of opinion that at these Phrygian ceremonies the representative of the god was probably slain each year by a cruel death, just as the god himself died. We know from Strabo that the priests of Pessinus were at one time potentates as well as priests. They may, therefore, have belonged to that class of divine kings or popes whose duty it was to die each year for their people and the world. The name of Attis, it is true, does not occur among the names of the old kings of Phrygia, who seem to have borne the names of Midas and Gordias in alternate generations. But a very ancient inscription carved in the rock above a famous Phrygian monument, which is known as the Tomb of Midas, records that the monument was made for, or dedicated to, King Midas by a certain Ates, whose name is doubtless identical with Attis, and who, if not a king himself, may have been one of the royal family. It is worthy of note, also, that the name Attis, which again appears to be only another form of Attis, is recorded as that of an early king of Lydia, and that a son of Croesus, king of Lydia, not only bore the name of Attis, but was said to have been killed while he was hunting a boar by a member of the royal Phrygian family who traced his lineage to King Midas and had fled to the court of Croesus because he had unwittingly slain his own brother. Scholars have recognized in this story of the death of Attis, son of Croesus, a mere double of the myth of Attis, and in view of the facts which have come before us in the present inquiry, it is a remarkable circumstance that the myth of a slain god should be told of a king's son. May we conjecture that the Phrygian priests who bore the name of Attis and represented the god of that name were themselves members, perhaps the eldest sons of the royal house, to whom their fathers, uncles, brothers, or other kinsmen deputed the honour of dying a violent death in the character of gods, while they reserved to themselves the duty of living, as long as nature allowed them, in the humbler character of kings. If this were so, the Phrygian dynasty of Midas may have represented a close parallel to the Greek dynasty of Athamas, in which the eldest sons seem to have been regularly destined to the altar. But it is also possible that the divine priests who bore the name of Attis may have belonged to the indigenous race which the Phrygians, on their irruption into Asia from Europe, appear to have found unconquered in the land afterwards known as Phrygia. On the latter hypothesis, the priests may have represented an older and higher civilization than that of their barbarous conquerors. Be that as it may, the god they personated was a deity of vegetation whose divine life manifested itself especially in the pine tree and the violets of spring. If they died in the character of that divinity, they corresponded to the mummers who were still slain in mimicry by European peasants in spring, and to the priest who was slain long ago in grim earnest on the wooded shore of the Lake of Nemi. End of section 14. Section 15. Of the Golden Bough. A Study in Magic and Religion. Part 4. Adonis-Attis-Osiris, Volume 1. by Sir James George Frazer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Chapter 5. The Hanged God. The way in which the representatives of Attis were put to death is perhaps shown by the legend of Marsyas, who was hung on a pine tree and flayed by Apollo. A reminiscence of the manner in which these old representatives of the deity were put to death is perhaps preserved in the famous story of Marsyas. He was said to be a Phrygian satyr or Silenus, according to others, a shepherd or herdsman who played sweetly on the flute. A friend of Cybele, he roamed the country with the disconsolate goddess to soothe her grief for the death of Attis. The composition of the mother's air, a tune played on the flute in honour of the great mother goddess, was attributed to him by the people of Selene in Phrygia. Vain of his skill, he challenged Apollo to a musical contest, he to play on the flute and Apollo on the lyre. Being vanquished, Marsyas was tied up to a pine tree and flayed or cut limb from limb, either by the victorious Apollo or by a Scythian slave. His skin was shown at Selene in historical times. It hung at the foot of the citadel in a cave from which the river Marsyas rushed with an impetuous and noisy tide to join the meander. So the Adonis bursts, full burn from the precipice of the Lebanon, so the blue river of Ibris lips in a crystal jet from the red rocks of the Taurus. So the stream, which now rumbles deep underground, used to gleam for a moment on its passage from darkness to darkness in the dim light of the Corinthian cave. In all these copious fountains, with their glad promise of fertility and life, men of old saw the hand of God and worshipped him beside the rushing river with the music of its tumbling waters in their ears. At Selene, if we can trust tradition, the piper Marsyas, hanged in his cave, had a soul for harmony even in death, for it is said that at the sound of his native Phrygian melodies the skin of the dead satyr used to thrill, but if the musician struck up an air in praise of Apollo, he remained deaf and motionless. Marsyas, apparently a double of Attis, the hanging and spearing of Odin and his human victims on sacred trees, the hanging and spearing of human victims among the Bagobos. In this Phrygian satyr, shepherd or herdsman who enjoyed the friendship of Cybele, practiced the music so characteristic for rites, and died a violent death on her sacred tree, the pine, may we not detect a close resemblance to Attis, the favourite shepherd or herdsman of the goddess, who is himself described as a piper, is said to have perished under a pine tree, and is annually represented by an effigy hung, like Marsyas, upon a pine. We may conjecture that in old days the priest who bore the name and played the part of Attis at the spring festival of Cybele was regularly hanged or otherwise slain upon the sacred tree, and that this barbarous custom was afterwards mitigated into the form in which it is known to us in latter times, when the priest merely drew blood from his body under the tree and attached an effigy instead of himself to its trunk. In the holy grove at Uppsala, men and animals were sacrificed by being hanged upon the sacred trees. The human victims dedicated to Odin were regularly put to death by hanging or by a combination of hanging and stabbing, the man being strung up to a tree or gallows and then wounded with a spear. Hence Odin was called the Lord of the Gallows or the God of the Hanged, and he is represented sitting under a gallows tree. Indeed, he is said to have been sacrificed to himself in the ordinary way, as we learn from the weird verses of the Havanal, in which the god describes how he acquired his divine power by learning the magic runes. I know that I hung on the windy tree for 9 whole nights, wounded with the spear dedicated to Odin. Myself to myself. The Bagobos of Mindanao, one of the Philippine Islands, used annually to sacrifice human victims for the good of the crops in a similar way. Early in December, when the constellation Orion appeared at 7 o'clock in the evening, the people knew that the time had come to clear their fields for sowing and to sacrifice a slave. The sacrifice was presented to certain powerful spirits as payment for the good year which the people had enjoyed, and to assure the favour of the spirits for the coming season. The victim was led to a great tree in the forest, There he is tied with his back to the tree and his arms stretched high above his head, in the attitude in which ancient artists portrayed Osiris hanging on the fatal tree. While he thus hung by the arms, he was slain by a spear thrust through his body at the level of the armpits. Afterwards the body was cut clean through the middle at the waist, and the upper part was apparently allowed to dangle for a little from the tree, while the under part wallowed in blood on the ground. The two portions were finally cast into a shallow trench beside the tree. Before this was done, anybody who wished might cut off a piece of flesh or a lock of hair from the corpse and carry it to the grave of some relation whose body was being consumed by a ghoul. Attracted by the fresh corpse, the ghoul would leave the mouldering old body in peace. These sacrifices have been offered by men now living. The hanging of Artemis, the hanging of Helen, the hanging of animal victims. In Greece, the great goddess Artemis herself appears to have been annually hanged in effigy in her sacred grove of Condylia among the Arcadian hills, and there accordingly she went by the name of the Hanged One. Indeed, a trace of a similar rite may perhaps be detected even at Ephesus, the most famous of her sanctuaries, in the legend of a woman who hanged herself and was thereupon dressed by the compassionate goddess in her own divine garb and called by the name of Hecate. Similarly, at Melite in Phthia, a story was told of a girl named Aspalis who hanged herself, but who appears to have been merely a form of Artemis. For after her death her body could not be found, but an image of her was discovered standing beside the image of Artemis, and the people bestowed on it the title of Hecarage, or far-shooter, one of the regular epithets of the goddess. Every year the virgins sacrificed a young goat to the image by hanging it, because Artapalis was said to have hanged herself. The sacrifice may have been a substitute for hanging an image or a human representative of Artemis. Again in Rhodes, the fair Helen was worshipped under the title of Helen of the Tree, because the queen of the island had caused her handmaids, disguised as furies, to string her up to a bough. That the Asiatic Greeks sacrificed animals in this fashion is proved by coins of Elam, which represented an ox or cow hanging on a tree and stabbed with a knife by a man, who sits among the branches or on the animal's back. At Hierapolis, also, the victims were hung on trees before they were burnt. With these Greek and Scandinavian parallels before us, we can hardly dismiss as wholly improbable the conjecture that in Phrygia a man-god may have hung year by year on the sacred but fatal tree. Use of the skins of human victims to effect their resurrection. In the tradition that Marsyas was flayed and that his skin was exhibited at Selene down to historical times, may well reflect a ritual practice of flaying the dead god and hanging his skin upon the pine as a means of effecting his resurrection, and with it the revival of vegetation in spring. Similarly, in ancient Mexico, the human victims who impersonated gods were often flayed, and their bloody skins worn by men who appeared to have represented the dead deities come to life again. When a Scythian king died, he was buried in a grave along with one of his concubines, his cupbearer, cook, groom, lacquey, and messenger, who were all killed for the purpose, and a great barrow was heaped up over the grave. A year afterwards 50 of his servants and 50 of his best horses were strangled, and their bodies, having been disemboweled and cleaned out, were stuffed with chaff, sewn up, and set on scaffolds round about the barrow, every dead man bestriding a dead horse, which was bitted and bridled as in life. These strange horsemen were no doubt supposed to mount guard over the king. The setting up of their stuffed skins might be thought to ensure their ghostly resurrection. Skins of men and horses stuffed and set up at graves. Some tribes of Borneo used the skulls of their enemies to ensure the fertility of the ground and of women, the abundance of game, and so forth. That some such notion was entertained by the Scythians is made probable by the account which the medieval traveller Di Plano Carpini gives of the funeral customs of the Mongols. The traveller tells us that when a noble Mongol died, the custom was to bury him seated in the middle of a tent, along with a horse saddled and bridled, and a mare and her foal. Also they used to eat another horse, stuff the carcass with straw, and set it up on poles. All this they did in order that in the other world the dead man might have a tent to live in, a mare to yield milk, and a steed to ride, and that he might be able to breed horses. Moreover, the bones of the horse, which they ate, were burned for the good of his soul. When the Arab traveller Ibn Battuta visited Peking in the 14th century, he witnessed the funeral of an emperor of China who had been killed in battle. The dead sovereign was buried along with 4 young female slaves and 6 guards in a vault, and an immense mound like a hill was piled over him. 4 horses were then made to run round the hillock till they could run no longer, after which they were killed, impaled, and set up beside the tomb. When an Indian Patagonia dies, he is buried in a pit along with some of his property. Afterwards, his favourite horse, having been killed, skinned, and stuffed, is popped up on sticks with his head turned towards the grave. At the funeral of a chief, 4 horses are sacrificed, and one is set up at each corner of the burial place. The clothes and other effects of the deceased are burned, and to conclude all, a feast is made of the horse's flesh. The Scythians certainly believed in the existence of the soul after death and in the possibility of turning it to account. This is proved by the practice of one of their tribes, the Taurians of the Crimea, who used to cut off the heads of their prisoners and set them on poles over their houses, especially over the chimneys, in order that the spirits of the slain men might guard the dwellings. Some of the savages of Borneo allege a similar reason for their favourite custom of taking human heads. The custom, said a Kayan chief, is not horrible. It is an ancient custom, a good beneficent custom, bequeathed to us by our fathers and our fathers' fathers. It brings us blessings, plentiful harvests, and keeps off sickness and pains. Those who were once our enemies hereby become our guardians, our friends, our benefactors. Thus, to convert dead foes into friends and allies, all that is necessary is to feed and otherwise propitiate their skulls at a festival when they are brought into the village. An offering of food is made to their heads, and their spirits, being thus appeased, cease to entertain malice against or to seek to inflict injury upon those who have got possession of the skull which formerly adorned the now forsaken body. When the sea Dyaks of Sarawak return home successfully from a head-hunting expedition, they bring the head ashore with much ceremony, wrapped in palm leaves. On shore in the village, the head for months after its arrival is treated with the greatest consideration, and all the names and terms of endearment of which their language is capable are abundantly lavished on it. The most dainty morsels, culled from their abundant though inelegant repast, are thrust into its mouth, and it is instructed to hate its former friends, and that having been now adopted into the tribe of its captors, its spirit must be always with them. Cereal leaves the betel nut and given to it, and finally a cigar is frequently placed between its ghastly and pallid lips. None of this disgusting mockery is performed with the intention of ridicule, but all to propitiate the spirit of kindness, and to procure its good wishes for the tribe, of whom it is now supposed to have become a member. Amongst these Dyaks, the head feast, which has been just described, is supposed to be the most beneficial in its influence of all their feasts and ceremonies. The object of them all is to make their rice grow well, to cause the forest to abound with wild animals, to enable their dogs and snares to be successful in securing game, to have the streams swarm with fish, to give health and activity to the people themselves, and to ensure fertility to their women. All these blessings, the possessing and feasting of a fresh head, are supposed to be the most efficient means of securing. The very ground itself is believed to be benefited and rendered fertile, more fertile even than when the water in which fragments of gold presented to the Raja have been washed has been sprinkled over it. The stuffed skin of the human representative of the Phrygian god may have been used for like purposes. In like manner, if my conjecture is right, the man who represented the father god of Phrygia used to be slain, and his stuffed skin hung on the sacred pine in order that his spirit might work for the growth of the crops, the multiplication of animals, and the fertility of women. So that Athens, an ox, which appears to have embodied the corn spirit, was killed at an annual sacrifice, and its hide stuffed with straw and sewn up was afterwards set on its feet and yoked to a plough as if it were ploughing, apparently in order to represent, or rather to promote, the resurrection of the slain corn spirit at the end of the threshing. This employment of the skins of divine animals for the purpose of ensuring the revival of the slaughtered divinity might be illustrated by other examples. Perhaps the hide of the bull, which was killed to furnish the regenerating bath of blood in the rites of Attis, may have been put to a similar use. End of section 15. Section 16. Of the Golden Bough, A Study in Magic and Religion. Part 4. Adonis-Attis-Osiris, Volume 1, by Sir James George Frazer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Chapter 6. Oriental Religions in the West. Popularity of the worship of Cybele and Attis in the Roman Empire. The worship of the great mother of the gods and her lover, or son, was very popular under the Roman Empire. Inscriptions prove that the two received divine honours, separately or conjointly, not only in Italy, and especially at Rome, but also in the provinces, particularly in Africa, Spain, Portugal, France, Germany, and Bulgaria. Their worship survived the establishment of Christianity by Constantine, for Symmachus records the recurrence of the festival of the Great Mother, and in the days of Augustine her effeminate priests still paraded the streets and squares of Carthage with whitened faces, scented hair, and mincing gait. While, like the mendicant friars of the Middle Ages, they begged alms from the passers-by. In Greece, on the other hand, the bloody orgies of the Asiatic goddess and her consort appear to have found little favour. The barbarous and cruel character of the worship, with frantic excesses, was doubtless repugnant to the good taste and humanity of the Greeks, who seem to have preferred the kindred but gentler rites of Adonis. Yet the same features which shocked and repelled the Greeks may have positively attracted the less refined Romans and barbarians of the West. The ecstatic frenzies, which were mistaken for divine inspiration, the mingling of the body, the theory of a new birth, and the remission of sins through the shedding of blood, have all their origin in savagery, and they naturally appealed to peoples in whom the savage instincts were still strong. Their true character was indeed often disguised under a decent veil of allegorical or philosophical interpretation, which probably sufficed to impose upon the rapt and enthusiastic worshippers, reconciling even the more cultivated of them to things which otherwise must have filled them with horror and disgust. The spread of Oriental faiths over the Roman Empire contributed to undermine the fabric of Greek and Roman civilization by inculcating the salvation of the individual soul as a supreme aim of life. The religion of the Great Mother, with its curious blending of crude savagery with spiritual aspirations, was only one of a multitude of similar Oriental faiths, which, in the latter days of paganism, spread over the Roman Empire, and by saturating the European peoples with alien ideals of life, gradually undermined the whole fabric of ancient civilization. Greek and Roman society was built on the conception of the subordination of the individual to the community, of the citizen to the state. It set the safety of the commonwealth as a supreme aim of conduct, above the safety of the individual, whether in this world or in a world to come. Trained from infancy in this unselfish ideal, the citizens devoted their lives to the public service and were ready to lay them down for the common good. Or if they shrank from the supreme sacrifice, it never occurred to them that they acted otherwise than basely in preferring their personal existence to the interests of their country. All this was changed by the spread of Oriental religions, which inculcated this communication of the soul with God and his external salvation as the only objects worth living for, objects in comparison with which the prosperity and even the existence of the state sank into insignificance. The inevitable result of this selfish and immoral doctrine was to withdraw the devotee more and more from the public service, to concentrate his thoughts on his own spiritual emotions, and to breed in him a contempt for the present life which he regarded merely as a probation for a better and an eternal. The saint and the recluse, disdainful of earth and wrapped in ecstatic contemplation of heaven, became in popular opinion the highest ideal of humanity, displacing the old ideal of the patriot and hero who, forgetful of self, lives and is ready to die for the good of his country. The earthly cities seemed poor and contemptible to men whose eyes beheld the city of God coming in the clouds of heaven. Thus the centre of gravity, so to say, was shifted from the present to a future life. And however much the other world may have gained, there can be little doubt that this one lost heavily by the change. A general disintegration of the body politic set in. The ties of the state and the family were loosened, the structure of society tended to resolve itself into its individual elements, and thereby to relapse into barbarism. For cultivation is only possible through the active cooperation of the citizens and their willingness to subordinate their private interest to the common good. Men refused to defend their country and even to continue their kind. In their anxiety to save their own souls and the souls of others, they were content to leave the material world, which they identified with the principle of evil, to perish around them. This obsession lasted for 1,000 years. The revival of Roman law, of the Aristotelian philosophy, of ancient art and literature at the close of the Middle Ages, marked the return of Europe to native ideals of life and conduct, to saner, manlier views of the world. The long halt in the march of civilization was over. The tide of Oriental invasion had turned at last. It is ebbing still. Popularity of the worship of Mithra, its resemblance to Christianity, and its rivalry with that religion. The festival of Christmas borrowed by the Church from the religion of Mithra. Among the gods of Eastern origin who in the decline of the ancient world competed against each other for the allegiance of the West was the old Persian deity Mithra. The immense popularity of his worship is attested by the monuments illustrative of it, which have been found scattered in profusion all over the Roman Empire. In respect both of doctrines and of rites, the cult of Mithra appears to have presented many points of resemblance, not only to the religion of the Mother of the Gods, but also to Christianity. The similarities struck the Christian doctors themselves, and was explained by them as a work of the devil who sought to seduce the souls of men from the true faith by a false and insidious imitation of it. So to the Spanish conquerors of Mexico and Peru, many of the native heathen rites appear to be diabolical counterfeits of the Christian sacraments. With more probability, the modern student of comparative religion traces such resemblances to the similar and independent workings of the mind of man in his sincere, if crude, attempts to fathom the secret of the universe, and to adjust his little life to its awful mysteries. However that may be, there can be no doubt that the Mithraic religion proved a formidable rival to Christianity, combining as it did a solemn ritual with aspirations after moral purity and a hope of immortality. Indeed, the issue of the conflict between the two faiths appeared for a time to have hung in the balance. An instructive relic of the long struggle is preserved in our festivals of Christmas, which the Church seems to have borrowed directly from its heathen rival. In the Julian calendar, the 25th of December was reckoned the winter solstice, and it was regarded as the nativity of the sun because the day begins to lengthen and the power of the sun to increase from that turning point of the year. The ritual of the nativity, as it appears to have been celebrated in Syria and Egypt, was remarkable. The celebrants retired into certain inner shrines, from which at midnight they issued with a loud cry, "The Virgin is brought forth, the light is waxing." The Egyptians even represented the newborn sun by the image of an infant, which on his birthday, the winter solstice, they brought forth and exhibited to his worshippers. No doubt the Virgin who thus conceived and bore a son on the 25th of December was a great Oriental goddess, whom the Semites called the Heavenly Virgin, or simply the Heavenly Goddess. In Semitic lands she was a form of Astarte. Now Mithra was regularly identified by his worshippers with the sun, the unconquered sun as they called him, hence his nativity also fell on the 25th of December. The Gospels say nothing as to the day of Christ's birth, and accordingly the early Church did not celebrate it. In time, however, the Christians of Egypt came to regard the 6th of January as the date of the Nativity, and the custom of commemorating the birth of the Saviour on that day gradually spread until the 4th day it was universally established in the East. But at the end of the 3rd or the beginning of the 4th century, the Western Church, which had never recognized the 6th of January as the day of the Nativity, adopted the 25th of December as the true date, and in time its decision was accepted also by the Eastern Church. At Antioch, the change was not introduced till about the year 375 AD. Motives for the institution of Christmas. What considerations led the ecclesiastical authorities to institute the festival of Christmas? The motives for the innovation are stated with great frankness by a Syrian writer, himself a Christian. The reason, he tells us, why the fathers transferred the celebration of the 6th of January to the 25th of December was this. It was a custom of the heathen to celebrate on the same 25th of December the birthday of the sun, at which they kindled lights in token of festivity. In these solemnities and festivities the Christians also took part. Accordingly, when the doctors of the church perceived that the Christians had a leaning to this festival, they took counsel and resolved that the true nativity should be solemnized on that day and the festival of the Epiphany on the 6th of January. Accordingly, along with this custom, the practice has prevailed of kindling fires till the 6th. The heathen origin of Christmas is plainly hinted at, if not tacitly admitted, by Augustine, when he exhorts his Christian brethren not to celebrate that solemn day like the heathen on account of the sun, but on account of him who made the sun. In like manner, Leo the Great rebuked the pestilent belief that Christmas was solemnized because of the birth of the new sun, as it was called, and not because of the nativity of Christ. The Easter celebration of the death and resurrection of Christ appears to have been assimilated to the celebration of the death and resurrection of Attis, which was held at Rome at the same season, heathen festivals displaced by a Christian. Thus it appears that the Christian Church chose to celebrate the birthday of its founder on the 25th of December in order to transfer the devotion of the heathen from the sun to him who was called the Son of Righteousness. If that was so, there can be no intrinsic improbability in the conjecture that motives of the same sort may have led the ecclesiastical authorities to assimilate the Easter festival of the death and resurrection of their Lord to the festival of the death and resurrection of another Asiatic god, which fell at the same season. Now the Easter rites still observed in Greece, Sicily, and southern Italy bear in some respects a striking resemblance to the rites of Adonis, and I suggested that the Church may have consciously adapted the new festival to its heathen predecessor for the sake of winning souls to Christ. But this adaptation probably took place in the Greek-speaking rather than in the Latin-speaking parts of the ancient world, for the worship of Adonis, while it flourished among the Greeks, appears to have made little impression on Rome and the West. Certainly it never formed part of the official Roman religion. The place which it might have taken in the affections of the vulgar was already occupied by the similar but more barbarous worship of Attis and the Great Mother. Now the death and resurrection of Attis were officially celebrated at Rome on the 24th and 25th of March, the latter being regarded as a spring equinox, and therefore as the most appropriate day for the revival of a god of vegetation who had been dead or sleeping throughout the winter. But according to an ancient and widespread tradition, Christ suffered on the 25th of March, and accordingly some Christians regularly celebrated the crucifixion on that day without any regard to the state of the moon. This custom was certainly observed in Phrygia, Cappadocia, and Gaul, and there seem to be grounds for thinking that at one time it was followed also in Rome. Thus the tradition was placed, the death of Christ on the 25th of March was ancient and deeply rooted. It is all the more remarkable because astronomical considerations prove that it can have had no historical foundation. The inference appears to be inevitable that the Passion of Christ must have been arbitrarily referred to that date in order to harmonize with an older festival of the spring equinox. This is the view of the learned ecclesiastical historian, Magistrat de Chien, who points out that the death of the Saviour was thus made to fall upon the very day on which, according to a widespread belief, the world had been created. But the resurrection of Attis, who combined in himself the characters of the Divine Father and the Divine Son, was officially celebrated at Rome on the same day. When we remember that the festival of St. George in April has replaced the ancient pagan festival of the Perilia, that the festival of St. John the Baptist in June has succeeded to a heathen midsummer festival of water, that the festival of the Assumption of the Virgin in August has ousted the festival of Diana, that the Feast of All Souls in November is a continuation of an old heathen feast of the dead, and that the Nativity of Christ himself was assigned to the winter solstice in December because that day was deemed the nativity of the sun. We can hardly be thought rash or unreasonable in conjecturing that the other cardinal festival of the Christian Church, the solemnization of Easter, may have been in like manner and from like motives of edification adapted to a similar celebration of the Phrygian god Attis at the vernal equinox. Coincidence between the pagan and the Christian festivals of the divine death and resurrection. At least it is a remarkable coincidence, if it is nothing more, that the Christian and the heathen festivals of the divine death and resurrection should have been solemnized at the same season and in the same places. For the places which celebrated the death of Christ at the spring equinox were Phrygia, Gaul, and apparently Rome, that is, the very regions in which the worship of Attis either originated or struck deepest root. It is difficult to regard the coincidence as purely accidental. If the vernal equinox, the season at which in the temperate regions the whole face of nature testifies to a fresh outburst of vital energy, had been viewed from of old as a time when the world was annually created afresh in the resurrection of a god, nothing could be more natural than to place the resurrection of the new deity at the same cardinal point of the year. Only it is to be observed that if the death of Christ was dated on the 25th of March, his resurrection, according to Christian tradition, must have happened on the 27th of March, which is about 2 days later than the vernal equinox of the Julian calendar and the resurrection of Attis. A similar displacement of 2 days in the adjustment of Christian to heathen celebrations occurs in the festivals of St. George and the Assumption of the Virgin. However, another Christian tradition, followed by Lactantius and perhaps by the practice of the Church in Gaul, placed the death of Christ on the 23rd and his resurrection on the 25th of March. If that was so, his resurrection coincided exactly with the resurrection of Attis. Different theories by which pagans and Christians explain the coincidence. In point of fact, it appears from the testimony of an anonymous Christian who wrote in the 4th century of our era that Christians and pagans alike were struck by the remarkable coincidence between the death and resurrection of their respective deities, and that the coincidence formed a theme of bitter controversy between the adherents of the rival religions. The pagans contending that the resurrection of Christ was a spurious imitation of the resurrection of Attis, and the Christians asserting with equal warmth that the resurrection of Attis was a diabolical counterfeit of the resurrection of Christ. In these unseemly bickerings, the heathen took what, to a superficial observer, might seem strongly ground, by arguing that their god was the older and therefore presumably the original, not the counterfeit, since as a general rule an original is older than its copy. The feeble argument the Christians easily rebutted. They admitted, indeed, that in point of time Christ was the junior deity, but they triumphantly demonstrated his real seniority by falling back on the subtlety of Satan, who on so important an occasion had surpassed himself by inverting the usual order of nature. Compromise of Christianity with paganism, parallel with Buddhism. Taken altogether, the coincidences of the Christian with the heathen festivals are too close and too numerous to be accidental. They mark the compromise which the Church, in the hour of its triumph, was compelled to make with its vanquished yet still dangerous rivals. The inflexible Protestantism of the primitive missionaries, with their fiery denunciations of heathendom, had been exchanged for the supple policy, the easy tolerance, the comprehensive charity of shrewd ecclesiastics, who clearly perceived that if Christianity was to conquer the world, it could do so only by relaxing the too rigid principles of its founder, by widening a little the narrow gate which leads to salvation. In this respect, an instructive parallel might be drawn between the history of Christianity and the history of Buddhism. Both systems were in their origin essentially ethical reforms, born of the generous ardour, the lofty aspirations, the tender compassion of their noble founders. Two of those beautiful spirits who appear at rare intervals on earth, like beings come from a better world to support and guide our weak and erring nature. Both preached moral virtue as the means of accomplishing what they regarded as the supreme object of life, the eternal salvation of the individual soul, though by curious antithesis, The one sought that salvation in a blissful eternity, the other in a final release from suffering in annihilation. But the austere ideals of sanctity which they inculcated were too deeply opposed not only to the frailties but to the natural instincts of humanity, ever to be carried out in practice by more than a small number of disciples, who consistently renounced the ties of the family and the state in order to work out their own salvation in the still seclusion of the cloister. If such faiths were to be nominally accepted by whole nations or even by the world, it was essential that they should first be modified or transformed so as to accord in some measure with the prejudices, the passions, the superstitions of the vulgar. This process of accommodation was carried out in after ages by followers who, made of less ethereal stuff than their masters, were for that reason the better fitted to mediate between them and the common herd. Thus, as time went on, the two religions, in exact proportion to their growing popularity, absorbed more and more of those baser elements which they had been instituted for the very purpose of suppressing. Such spiritual decadences are inevitable. The world cannot live at the level of its great men. Yet it would be unfair to the generality of our kind to ascribe wholly to their intellectual and moral weakness the gradual divergence of Buddhism and Christianity from their primitive patterns. For it should never be forgotten that by their glorification of poverty and celibacy, both these religions struck straight at the root not merely of civil society but of human existence. The blow was parried by the wisdom or the folly of the vast majority of mankind who refused to purchase a chance of saving their souls with the certainty of extinguishing the species. Chapter 7. Hyacinth. The Greek hyacinth interpreted as the vegetation which blooms and withers away. Another mythical being who has been supposed to belong to the class of gods here discussed is Hyacinth. He too has been interpreted as a vegetation which blooms in spring and withers under the scorching heat of the summer sun. Though he belongs to Greek, not to Oriental mythology, some account of him may be out of place in the present discussion. According to the legend, Hyacinth was the youngest and handsomest son of the ancient king Amyclas, who had his capital at Amyclae in the beautiful vale of Sparta. One day, playing at quoits with Apollo, he was accidentally killed by a blow of the god's quilt. Bitterly the god lamented the death of his friend. The hyacinth, that sanguine flower inscribed with woe, sprang from the blood of the hapless youth, as anemones and roses from the blood of Adonis, and violets from the blood of Attis. Like these vernal flowers, it heralded the advent of another spring, and gladdened the hearts of men with the promise of a joyful resurrection. The flower is usually supposed to be not what we call a hyacinth, but a little purple iris with the letters of lamentation, Ai, which in Greek means alas, clearly inscribed in black on its petals. In Greece it blooms in spring after the early violets but before the roses. One spring when the hyacinths were in bloom, it happened that the red-coated Spartan regiments lay encamped under the walls of Corinth. Their commander gave the Amyclaean battalion leave to go home and celebrate as usual the festival of Hyacinth in their native town. But the sad flower was to be to these men an omen of death, for they had not gone far before they were enveloped by clouds of light-armed foes and cut to pieces. The tomb and the festival of Hyacinth at Amyclae. The tomb of Hyacinth was at Amyclae under a massive altar-like pedestal, which supported an archaic bronze image of Apollo. In the left side of the pedestal was a bronze door, and through it offerings were passed to Hyacinth, as to a hero or a dead man, not as to a god, before sacrifices were offered to Apollo at the annual Hyacinthian festival. Bas-reliefs carved on the pedestal represented Hyacinth and his maiden sister Polypoeia, caught up to heaven by a company of goddesses. Their annual festival of the Hyacinthiae was held in the month of Hecatombius, which seems to have corresponded to May. The ceremonies occupied 3 days. On the first, the people mourned for Hyacinth, wearing no wreaths, singing no paeans, eating no bread, and behaving with great gravity. It was on this day probably that the offerings were made at Hyacinth's tomb. Next day the scene was changed. All was joy and bustle. The capital was emptied of its inhabitants, who poured out in their thousands to witness and share the festivals at Amyclae. Boys in high-girt tunics sang hymns in honor of the god to the accompaniment of flutes and lyres. Others, splendidly attired, paraded on horseback in the theatre. Choirs of youths chanted their native ditties. Dancers danced, maidens rode in wicker carriages or went in procession to witness the chariot races. Sacrifices were offered in profusion. The citizens feasted, their friends, and even their slaves. This outburst of gaiety may be supposed to have celebrated the resurrection of Hyacinth and perhaps also his ascension to heaven, which, as we have seen, was represented on his tomb. However, it may be that the ascension took place on the third day of the festival, but as to that we know nothing. The sister who went to heaven with him was by some identified with Artemis or Persephone. Hyacinth, an Aboriginal god, perhaps a king, who was worshipped in Laconia before the invasion of the Dorians. His sister Polyboea may perhaps have been his spouse. It is highly probable, as Erwin Rode perceived, that Hyacinth was an old Aboriginal deity of the underworld who had been worshipped at Amyclae long before the Dorians invaded and conquered the country. If that was so, the story of his relation to Apollo must have been a comparatively late invention, an attempt of the newcomers to fit the ancient god of the land into their own mythical system, in order that he might extend his protection to them. On this theory, it may not be without significance that sacrifices at the festival were offered to Hyacinth, as to a hero, before they were offered to Apollo. Further, on the analogy of similar deities elsewhere, we should expect to find Hyacinth coupled, not with a male friend, but with a female consort. That consort may perhaps be detected in his sister Polyboea, who was sent to heaven with him. The new myth, even if it was, of the love of Apollo for Hyacinth would involve a changed conception of the Aboriginal god, which in its turn must have affected that of his spouse. For when Hyacinth came to be thought of as young and unmarried, there was no longer room in his story for a wife, and she should have to be disposed of in some other way. What was easier for the myth-maker than to turn her into his unmarried sister? However we may explain it, a change seems certainly to have come over the popular idea of Hyacinth, for whereas on his tomb he was portrayed as the bearded man, later art represented him as the pink of youthful beauty. But it is perhaps needless to suppose that the sisterly relation of Polyboea to him was a late modification of the myth. The stories of Cronos and Rhea, of Zeus and Hera, of Osiris and Isis, remind us that in old days gods, like kings, often married their sisters, and probably for the same reason, namely to ensure their own title to the throne under a rule of female kinship which treated women and not men as a channel in which the blood royal flowed. It is not impossible that Hyacinth may have been a divine king who actually reigned in his lifetime at Amyclae and was afterwards worshipped at his tomb. The representation of his triumphal ascent to heaven in company with his sister suggests that, like Adonis and Persephone, he may have been supposed to spend one part of the year in the underworld of darkness and death, and another part in the upper world of light and life. And as the anemones and the sprouting corn marked the return of Adonis and Persephone, so the flowers to which he gave his name may have heralded the ascension of Hyacinth. End of Volume 1. The end of The Golden Bough by Sir James George Frazer, Part 4, Religion-Adonis-Attis-Osiris, Volume 1. Recorded by Leon Harvey.